This show is part of the Darkmoor Podcast Network.
To join our community Discord or see more content from our members, visit darkmoorpodcasts.com.
In today's episode, we explore a few tools to break down your world-building blocks, as well as explore just a touch of the neurolinguistics you may employ at your table. This is the DM Shower Thoughts. Welcome back. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts, the show where we talk about our shower thoughts in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons and other tabletop scenarios and how to become your best self through gaming. My name is Adamus.
I'm John.
And I'm Ian.
Now, I'm going to kick things off with a thought that we just finished up a 3-part series looking at Tasha's... I almost said Tasha's Hideous Laughter. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything as our latest published resource. And I've been doing a lot of product drafting. So setting content, new player races, new archetypes, lots of things built out to my patrons to the DM's Den, and then building out more things for content that we produce, and really looking at it not from just here's a spreadsheet of all these things that we can do, or here's this extra Word document that's a little messy, but here you go, but trying to make it look as professional as possible. And in producing those things, it has brought out all of the resources that I've collected or created over time. And there's a few of these that I want to open up for discussion, whether you guys use them and what their value might be. And as we dive into it, this might also serve as a wonderful resource for all of you newer DMs out there, or DMs wanting to kind of up your game. And if you ever suffer, because everybody suffers from this, is the world building writer's block. And I find that when I get hung up on that, it's like I have all this energy to produce something, but then when it comes to like literally sit down and write about it, I get stuck. And that's that world-building writer's block, where you have all that energy, but then it's hard to get moving. And something that I use, so there are some great resources out there. And this might even tie further into encounter design, into environmental hazards, which is a feature of Tasha's Hideous Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, of Tasha's. I'm going to start diving into that. But now, the first thing that comes to mind is naming conventions. Whenever we have, like, Xanathar's Guide has now a wonderful thing in the back resource of what name do I want to use? So when I dive a lot deeper into world building and city building, I need to populate that city, and having things ready is sometimes difficult. The bigger the worlds get and the more campaigns that I run, I'm doing about 6 a month, and those sometimes meet every 2 weeks or every week or once a month, so it's kind of meh. Now, one of the things I use is fantasynamegenerators.com. There's your plug. And it's a wonderful little resource run by at least one person, but I think it might be a team of 2 now. But it's an insane little resource, a lot of automated randomizers, which is really helpful. However, and this needs to be said at the beginning of all of this, anything that you use as a resource is not a locked-in resource. You're not saying, oh, I'm pulling from here and therefore that thing I'm pulling is law. It is all an act of inspiration. It's just meant to jumpstart me. So when I use fantasy name generators, what I end up using them for is like, okay, they have this huge list of tabs, and then I want an elven name. Now, my naming conventions for elves may be different than what the mainstream fantasy conventions are. This is just meant for me to jumpstart. I don't pick from that list and go, there's a person, there's a person, there's a person. What I end up doing is I go, give me some male names. And I'll take like the first half of one name and the second half of another name and change it around a little bit. And now I have an elf name. But I'm not taking them strictly from their list. And I do that because some of these randomizers, they come from a mishmash of of lore, of like general mainstream lore. So like you'll go to the orc names and they'll come out as something impronounceable. You give me an orc name. Well, that's not helpful, like how do I say that? And really what it should be is I can take some of those letters, move things around, and it's inspiring to me. And I'm wondering if now Xanathar's guy did a really good job in creating, here's a bunch of orc names and they're pronounceable. Here's a bunch of elven names and they're pronounceable. Here's a bunch of English names, like human names from all these different dialects and regions. And you can kind of figure out, okay, how do I say that? Okay, good. It doesn't look like a whole bunch of random letters. Now, I'm curious if either of you guys have used any sort of naming resources, or where you like to pull from your resources, because I'll find things from other fiction and go, well, that's interesting. How would I say that but differently? I find I use a thesaurus a lot more often nowadays as I've been doing more writing than I ever did in the early creative writing days. I find that it's all to avoid derivative context.
All right, so Xanathar's guide got a lot of flack for the naming generator in its back with the D100 tables. And I think where it was coming from was, this feels kind of lazy, and I'm getting this instead of something else. And to me, it's like, obviously the D&D books, they all have different amount of pages. Like, it's not like if they had a better idea, they didn't cut something so that they could include a name generator. I have used that name generator so many times because I think it's great. I think that sometimes there's an entertainment factor in, especially if you have to make an NPC on the spot, to like, you can almost make a mini game out of it, of like, oh, let's see what this person's first name is gonna be, let's see what this person's family name is gonna be, like, and that can make an NPC memorable all by themselves, is a player kind of seeing that in action. So, I mean, my mom, her favorite NPC I ever did was Mizzix, right? Who is this random goblin you guys adopted along the way. And I literally just opened up Ravnica, and I went to the goblin names, rolled a random name, and that's how that character was born. So I think that a lot of times, especially if you want to create something that sounds authentic, the Xanathar's table in the back of that book is like the official publication. I also see nothing wrong with thinking of your characters' cultures and then finding a cultural name that matches up. So if in your world, Dragonborn have this like Japanese samurai culture, and they're very, there is a very strict code of etiquette, and there's, they wield katanas. Looking under the Japanese name section is going to help, it's just a list of generic names based on culture, right? Or if, your elves tend to be Celtic, going to the Celtic names and just rolling randomly. A lot of times, it starts to thin that membrane between our world and the fantasy world. But sometimes you just need a little bit of that for players to instantly be able to connect to whatever NPC they're dealing with. So it's really, I think sometimes it could be really memorable if you meet an orc just named Roger, like it's almost more memorable that they're not saying name something like Duth O'Clock, right? Because now it's like, well, where did Roger come from? And the orc's like, well, I had to assimilate into this culture, and that might not be a comfortable topic for everybody. But the idea is that a lot of times you'll get that, So it's a way to make your world more immersive, because again, like Ian says, how much realism do you want in your fantasy world? And a lot of times that's a very real thing. I've had students that it's like their name is like a bunch of characters in a language I can't read. And I'm like, oh, well, what do you prefer to go by? They're like, oh, Sam. Their name is actually like 10 syllables long, but they're like, I go by Sam. So sometimes that's where the name comes from, and then you get to ask interesting questions. Where does the name come from?
This can reveal interesting naming, not even just naming conventions, but cultural conventions in your world. So like for me, orcs are tribal. There's actually a tiered system to their names. So if an orc has a title like Grimjaw the Stonehand, they've earned that title, and they were not Grimjaw when they were born. They might have just been Jaw or Blah or Irk, and through a rite of passage, they've earned their adult name, even if they reach their adulthood when they're elderly. Once they pass that rite of passage, they earn their name, and then later they do another cool thing and they earn their title, and their title is based on that cool thing that they did. And there's something very interesting about seeing that progression. So you can have a young orc a middle-aged orc who's an adventurer who has not become blooded, who has not made their first big thing. And now, heck, if that was a player character, how much more powerful is the moment when they are named, when they are blooded? They do something really cool, and then they can choose their name instead of using the strange name that was given to them. And how empowering could that be? And that's just a naming convention, but that can tell a lot more about your society than just my name is Bob. And yet, my name is Bob is really fun and works in other contexts as well. My big point is here that you don't have to be bound by those elements. That this is an act of inspiration. So I can use these resources, but I'm never bound to them. Great thing, it's happened with Xanathar too, that I'll take a name and then go, I don't like that. Or I'll roll on the table and go, that's what I got, but I like this better. And I'll just change my mind. But by doing the roll, that's the thing that pushed my brain to kind of get into the next section.
Yeah, one of my favorite things to do with names is using naming conventions as kind of a template. I like what you did with the orcs there. I think that's a really cool way to do it, and it just makes me wonder what the longest orc name is that ever lived. Because it's just like, wouldn't they be legendary, like they might as well be, Grumsh or something like that. They're just an orc god king at this point with this ridiculously long name, something like that. That would be pretty cool. As for me, I tend to, when I'm coming up with names that aren't conventional, like English names or Swedish names or something like that, which I have done. It's a lot of fun, just to translate things from Swedish to English. The thing that I do is I come up with phonetic consonants and vowels that work well together. So I pick if it starts with the consonant, I pick a consonant and then I put A-E-I-O-U after it, and then one more consonant after that. But it can't be the same consonant. This sounds complicated, but in my head, it's not. So like when I came up with for example, the name of my custom continent on the world of, I think I called it Marin or something. Sorry, I only ever refer to it as Corsara. So I started with the phonetic syllable of core, and I was like, that's pretty cool. There's a lot of words in the English language that start with core. Like corvid, ravens, things like that, just flat out core, like a metallic core. I think that sounds neat. And so what would follow an R? What sounds good? Well, I'm not going to use a K, because then it would just be cork. And I'm not going to use a B because it's corb, and it's like, no. So I just kind of run the list to see what consonant sounds good next. And I kind of just fill in the blank from there. Now, that being said, that's how I sometimes choose to do it. The other time I choose to do it is I have a naming template. So, for example, again, with orcs. My orcs live in the desert. Okay, so I draw some inspiration from Arabic or Egyptian in real world languages, and then I always add an apostrophe because apostrophes are cool, and it implies that there is some sort of language, thing that needs to be demystified by learning the language. Like if you don't know that, if you don't speak the language, you might not know there's an apostrophe there, and then there's like a subtle intonation, I guess you could say, a change in how you pronounce that name that only native speakers will recognize if you do it wrong or something like that. And that kind of gives these names a semblance of what could be a language, even though it's not really. And that's what because the goal isn't to create a whole new language or to create a whole new like naming system, like in the Elder Scrolls, where every orc, who I think every male orc or something, has the word grow and then dash some last name. Not like, hold on. So in the Elder Scrolls, somebody might be named Cor Grobunk or something like that. Grobunk is their last name, and every time there's like a grow and then something else. So that's like their family name. So you don't have to come up with something like that, where it's a little bit more intricate. You could just make it seem like you did by adding phonetics or by adding consonants or apostrophes, like I do. The Kir Shul Sansi is an orcish naming convention, but it doesn't mean anything. So like you don't have to worry too much about whether or not your players are going to be able to translate these names and figure out what they actually mean. Like in Swedish, where a town is called Jubro, which means earth bridge. You just have to make it seem like you could. And that's my favorite thing to do, is to kind of like lay these little hints to something that doesn't exist. Because I think that's a good way to world build. It's one of my favorite things to do.
On a previous episode, we had referenced how our naming conventions can tell a story of their own, but they don't have to. It's the hints of a story, the hints of a mythology, or the hints of a history, even. And I find that I consume video games like books sometimes, and it can be really interesting to look at the depth of world building that's all under the surface with certain games, because you can have the player that never touches any of that depth, but it's there. Something is interesting there. So I look at Final Fantasy XII. Final Fantasy XII has a lot of culture and depth to its presentation that the player will probably never touch. And it has certain naming conventions with characters that I go, oh, that's really interesting. Let me write that spelling down. Oh, that's how you pronounce it? All right, how do I mess with that? And then how do I mess with that by adding a French Creole flair to it? And how do I mess with this dialect? If people named this way speak this way. And if they're named this way and they speak this way, what is their culture like? But all of that can stem from this one name that I heard in this one scene of Final Fantasy XII. And it's just being open to that inspiration, going, that's cool, and then I write it down. It's consuming that media can be really interesting. But on that frame of certain media that I find really interesting in this, I highly recommend this book. We've mentioned it a few times on the podcast, which is The Monsters Know What They're Doing. Excellent resource, and it helps me figure out the next section of this, where I pull from resources, which is on behaviors and encounters. And I'm finding that I have pulled so far away now from opening the monster manual and looking at a monster, and so far away from even, I've got a box of stat trackers of these little cards of all the monsters, and I can put them on my DM screen and kind of set them into an initiative order, and then I have their info in a physical space, and that's been really cool. But now that we moved a lot of our things to Roll20, I find I don't really pull from the monster manual so much as I have an idea for a monster in my mind, and I'll jot down some notes about them. I'll have descriptive mechanics ready. I'll have maybe 6 attributes and an action economy. And if I have time, I might do a little bit more research about, well, what would the mechanics be of this, and what would I change if it's in Volo's Guide or Mordenkainen's or the monster manual, or if it's a custom monster or it's an adapted monster. But I'll find that I have the idea first for the behavior of the monster or the encounter, and that's in place before their stats even come into being. It's more about the designing the encounter. What do they see in this cave? What could they see in this cave? And if they go here, then what could this be? And I'm finding that to be really energizing, because it stops being about, here, let me flip through the monster manual for this random thing you're going to encounter. And instead, it takes more time, but there's a nature to it. So if they encounter strange moss growing on the walls of a cave, maybe that's tied to the creature inside of it. Instead of, they wander through the cave and you run into a bunch of rust monsters. What if there's moss growing on the walls that can slowly rust your gear and you're not supposed to touch it? That can also provide hints to what the monster is. But when I think about these things, that book is fantastic. And then the other side of that is, there's a section of Tasha's called Parlaying with Monsters, or just, Parlaying with Monsters. And it does a nice deep dive into what sort of skills might give you information on certain monsters, so you might be able to figure this stuff out. But I love it that they break down some basic desired offerings of ways to bargain with creatures. Maybe the answer isn't just kill it. There are opportunities here. So an aberration, giving an aberration flattery or secrets or lore that it doesn't already know, that could be really cool and a really great bargaining chip to pass through their realm. If you give them something really cool, maybe you have an aberrant ally, at least for a limited time. Even if it's a temporary or difficult alliance. And I love that, your fiends, one of the biggest things, your fiend, offer your soul. Because duh. But blood from a living or recently slain loved one. Like, oh, how terrible. But also, as you get into these, if you start looking at what their possible desires are, and you already know, as if you make a knowledge check, what those desires are, you as the player can also discern, can we bargain our way out of being crushed by a giant? Can we bargain our way out of a fiend's grasp? Giant? Maybe. Fiend, if we know what they desire and those are too high of a cost, then it limits our choices, but at least we know that. And we don't go walk in going, yes, we'll strike a deal. Okay, your soul. And then you're stuck. There's a great power to knowledge in that way. And also this opens the door. This can work as inspiration as well. Maybe the giants in your world don't want ale. Maybe they don't care about giant rivalry, so they don't need treasure stolen from a rival giant. But maybe they desire something else. And it's really important for us as DMs and players to think about, how do you parlay with a monster? How do you navigate the world that you're not just a murder hobo trying to just hack your way through whatever strikes your path? There's great value to that. Plus, in behavior design and encounter design, the deal could turn sour. And what are the triggers that could turn that deal sour? What are the triggers that could turn it back toward an amiable response? One of my apprentices ran a game recently, and there was a high chance that we were going to have to fight this creature. And in offering up one of ourselves temporarily to be bitten by this creature and then allow it to see through our eyes so it can see the outside world, then that creature became a tentative ally, a very powerful tentative ally. but we took a hit and a distinct cost, detriment, by being bitten by this creature. But it was so much better for us to parlay with this entity rather than fight them, just because, one, also they had a lot more knowledge than we did, and we don't know as many things going in. It was just and they offered that first because it's so easy to kill us to them that maybe the monster wants to parlay. Maybe the monster is bored and it's too boring to kill you. Wouldn't it be more interesting? Maybe you're a little bit smarter than the average adventurer and you can strike a deal with me instead of just dying by my claws. Thoughts?
Yeah, I think the key thing that you brought up, Adam, that goes into making interesting gameplay decisions is creating a different amount of risk and reward based on whatever your two options are. So, for example, like a fiend, you may not want to bargain with it because killing it is just easier than selling your soul to it, you know? But now if there's something on the line, like the demon is like, all right, you can kill me, but the whole town will still explode from the magic circle I set up under it. Like, now the circumstances have changed, so the risk and reward has also changed as well. And the other thing is that once you understand a monster's behavior, it doesn't have to be you that's bargaining with it. So it might be that you're investigating why a creature is behaving in a way that you didn't expect, and it might be because it's bargaining with something else. There's a lot of adventures actually that are published where it's like, you know, why are the Duragar in Kundrakar, right? Yeah, that's the Forge of Fury. Why are the Duragar like shooting at us? It's like, well, it's because right now their tentative parlay with the Black Dragon is that if we give it adventurer's gear, it doesn't eat us. So if you're a player that investigates kind of that bargaining, even if it ends up in a fight, you might not be fighting this thing, you know? So, and I think that's the thing. Like, I played in a game on Wednesday where my grandma wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons. She's always loved fantasy and sci-fi and stuff, and she was just interested in seeing what this medium had to offer. She wanted to be a bard that could talk its way out of problems, right? So, but rather than just allow it to be, oh, I talk out of problems, everyone's friends. Like, how do you now make it interesting from a gameplay perspective? You know, so you're not just shortcutting and almost in a way creating a more shallow experience. It's an additional challenge now. We can talk our way out of problems, but that's maybe the thing, we have to talk something down, and that requires a check, you know? And then if you fail that check, it's worse than if you just kind of went into combat and dealt non-lethal damage, you know? Sometimes the fastest way to successfully end a diplomacy is to escalate violence quicker than the other person, right? Strike first, strike hard, no mercy, right? But sometimes the other side of that is also true, where Cobra Kai season 3 came out and strike first. But sometimes you just have to sit back and listen. And it was really interesting watching how my mom and my sister decided to play their characters, because they were always escalate violence as soon as possible. And there was a lot of scenarios where my grandma was right. It's like, hey, maybe if we like not blow up this goblin and disintegrate them into ash just because they looked at us the wrong way, maybe we could learn, I don't know, where their boss is. And it's just really interesting to watch player habits and to see their train of thought and how it might be different from how they approach it as a player versus how they try to RP it as a character. And one of the things that came up, this was mentioned in one of Ian's games, was like a DM was like, you know, I only have one player that's asking a lot of questions. And it's like, yeah, because I as a player am frustrated because the way the character I've played has ended up being designed, the character wouldn't ask questions. The character isn't designed to ask questions. The character is designed to talk people down and to be very persuasive. They are not meant to be investigative. So I have to now lean on other players to be investigative when those players choose not to do their role. Because again, roles isn't just a combat thing. You've got out of combat roles too. Now I as a player am stuck and I'm getting frustrated, you know? So I had to abandon and retire a character because none of the other players were picking up their out of combat slack. So it's kind of like when a support caster never heals anybody, you know? It ends up somewhere similar. So parlaying monsters is just another tool in kind of your party's toolbox. It's not always the best answer, but sometimes a clever DM can create a more enriching experience when they really deep dive into a monster's motivations and behaviors, even if it doesn't directly affect the party.
There's a thing that you mentioned, John, about if a character has to make deals with other creatures. It brings to mind a really good example of this in fiction. So I've mentioned before a book series called the Dresden Files. This is the story of Harry Dresden, who is a wizard. And the world is pretty massive now. It's written by Jim Butcher. And at least in the first half of the series, Dresden does a really good job of he's chivalrous and a little volatile, but he's also very smart. And he understands he's powerful when he needs to be, but there are so many things that are bigger than him and more powerful and older than he is. That he does a very good job of crushing the things that need to be crushed and defending himself when he needs to. But a lot of the time, he might get himself in some deep doo-doo and then have to strike a deal to get out of it. And he has all these deals that he's always juggling, and these little moments where he, talks to an archfey, pisses them off, and then strikes a deal to kind of mitigate circumstances, but still come out of it mostly on top. But he's got this ticking time bomb of deals. And how interesting is that from a character's perspective? And then if you have a player that's like, okay, no, I'm going to give you this in exchange for you letting us pass here, and then having to follow through on that or make another deal to avoid that deal and parlay here so that this doesn't happen and that I don't approach this again. There's a juggling there, but there's also an interesting story. Because there will be a point, and there is a point in Dresden where all those deals kind of stack on top of it, and he stops having to balance as much. But I find that very intriguing because you can navigate a world where you're not the top dog if you have information, if you have knowledge, you have the right connections, and you're building that network of possibilities that you could become friends with a giant. And what sort of in does that give you instead of you're the giant killer? And how many more opportunities are available to us if we, I'm not saying make friends with the aberration, but strike a deal with the aberration, work a way into that. Now you have a lot more moments of NPCs and characters returning. And from a storytelling perspective, from the DM's perspective, I've had so many times early in my career where I would make this NPC and put a lot of time and energy into them, and the players would not be of the mindset that they should talk to them and would just kill them. And now it's like, well, there were opportunities there, but they're dead now, so there went that opportunity. Okay. And how much more interesting could that be? And then you read on forums, they keep killing all my contacts. Well, they're not interested in talking. Well, how do we fix that? Well, let's make the contact be a 5th level paladin. They lay the smackdown on the players, and therefore they'll learn their lesson. What if the lesson is they're not trusted? The king not only puts a hit out on them, but says, you keep killing my contacts, so you're the villains of the story now. Instead of punishing them, here, let me make sure my contacts are protected by high level paladins as just trying to one up one another. What if you've ruined that relationship based on those facts? There's a lot there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that can come up with that, and this is so I find some DMs have a hard time with this, is asking the question, what did I do wrong? You know? So, for example, and I already know what I did, but our most recent Geras game, I wanted to present an NPC that was basically like powerful crime boss, but like not evil is relative, you know? So like the reason she's a powerful crime boss is she owns all the gambling halls in the city. And she's like a loan shark and she does underground fight clubs. But there's like a code of honor. Like she won't hurt kids, right? She'll always give somebody a second chance, but if they blow their second chance, they never get a third. You know, drugs is not something she allows in her neighborhood. Like, in fact, when she's in power, her neighborhood gets cleaned up and it prospers more. As soon as I said the word crime lord, I had like 2 players instantly be like, I draw weapons and I want to make sure I attack them because that's not good. And it's like, what did I miss in my pre-framing that would have allowed this to be a more enriching dynamic experience rather than crime bad, let's kill, you know? So a lot of times I find that if it's that situation, Adam, it might be that the DM did not present the encounter in a way that made the players that encouraged the players to talk to them, you know? So if it's like, if they just wanted to fight this creature and they didn't want to talk, well, maybe it's the creature was really creepy. Maybe they really like, there was something in the player's real world experience that they really like poked the wrong way. You know, that happened in a Night Owls game we played where I said one thing and it like, there was another character that couldn't even salvage the relationship. And I really didn't mean to. I was trying to play off charming British gentleman, and what this other player interpreted as was creepy stalker guy. And it was in the first hour of the game. It was the first sentence I said, and it was completely boom, right? So sometimes, you know, for a DM, if that happens where you're like, oh, I wanted this NPC to be someone they could parlay, someone they could talk to, what about the way that you set up the encounter encouraged them? Because really that's what the players, that they were encouraged to fight, you know? The last thing before I send it over to Ian is that the other interesting thing about parlaying with monsters that are particularly weird is you get to open a door, and what happens if you close another one? How does that affect the parlaying? For example, you've been mentioning parlaying with aberrations. What if, as part of parlaying with the aberration, they make a big eyeball tattoo on your cheek? So now everybody knows that you've parlayed with an aberration. So yes, you get to get your foot in the door in one kind of network, but that may close you off from society on the surface, you know? So, and that's where parlaying can become really interesting. The Witcher 3 did an awesome job with the Hearts of Stone DLC, where like as soon as Geralt made a deal with one of the creatures, he had this massive tattoo on his face that would burn whenever he would act against that creature's wishes. So now the object of the quest is to get the tattoo off of him, you know? So that's where parlaying can be really interesting. That particular situation I was talking about really had to do more with player personality than any sort of RPing personality. That this player, based on the mechanics they had built to, was confident enough that it's basically, I can kill whatever and get away with it. And that's where sometimes, unfortunately, you've got to communicate with the world. You can't just get away with everything. We're playing a storytelling game. It's still a game, but it's a storytelling game. And if you just go around murdering everything, you know, sometimes just because the mechanics will let you get away with it doesn't mean that story-wise you want to get away with it, you know, because it means you're not getting away with something else.
Yeah, and that particular scenario was pretty interesting for my character, Moo, because I'm kind of playing Moo as a detective-y kind of character, where I am investigative, I am trying to be perceptive, and I'm trying to, not just skillfully perceptive, but also role-playing perceptive. Whenever I write something about myself, it's always like, I'm like adjusting, my stance. I'm looking around the room. I'm trying to perceive as much as possible to gather data, basically, because he's a Warforged. And so in that scenario, it was interesting because even though Mu is like good aligned, more or less, he wasn't thinking like, oh, I got to kill this person, because he was very aware that this is a crime lord. This is like a person with a lot of, with their finger in pretty much every pie in the city and stuff, and that they are dangerous. But because they're dangerous doesn't mean that I need to kill them right away, especially not in their home territory. And that also means that when just the sheer fact that, and I tried to communicate this, the sheer fact that I was there, that I was in that room, behind doors with guards, with their guards right across from me with, strong looking arms and stuff. It just implies that I'm in a situation that I'm not in control of, because I'm in control of myself. But just as, like, if I slip up, basically, she could just call as many people as she wants and have me killed. And that was what I tried to communicate to the other characters, more or less. But they just weren't really interested. They kind of just jumped the gun and were like, I need to fight. Like, crime bad. And yeah, I also think crime bad, but I also live and it is fun. And it's just like, socially speaking, what if you went into, like, because there are gangs in the real world, if you went into a gang lord's house and they have all their gang members around them and they just want to talk to you about getting this job done, like, you're not really in a position to refuse, at least not to their face, like, because they're more likely to escalate the situation and say, all right, if you won't do it, then I'll get somebody else, but I can't let you live because now you know. So yeah.
Yeah, one thing that also happened that I think some of the players are forgetting is they were doing, like, actively trying to steal things. Like, I just want to steal stuff. It's like, great, but that's going to sour their relationship before you even get the chance to talk to them, So, and I think that was, looking back on it, that's a key detail that I think got missed is, listen, as the DM, I was approaching this because the crime boss knows you just swiped something, you just took something from her. That's going to change how she talks to you. And it's all these little details that will add to kind of how an NPC reacts and everything.
Yeah, exactly. And of course, you can look at it the other way too, which is that my character is just not that kind of, aggressive character. Like, he's ruthless, but he's not aggressive. It's a Crane kind of mindset, in my opinion, where I portray myself as the Crane. I portray myself as passive, as an observer, as somebody who tries to avoid a fight whenever possible. But then in the fight, I'm ruthless. I am the tiger, that kind of thing. This is all referring to our dojo's cool animal mindset things that we talk about a lot. The other thing I was going to say was, when setting up those encounters that seem to go wrong as the DM, you really do have to consider, overall, what led up to this point. How did I get here? Yep, that's me. You may be wondering how I got here. No, like, that meme. But when you feel like you set up an encounter with a contact NPC and the players are just like, nope, just kill him. It's like, well, what did I do as the DM that conveyed this signal that this is somebody you can't trust, and you can't trust to them to the extent that you have to kill them? And that's how I kind of look at it when I'm retracing my steps to try and figure out how to do better next time, to make it seem more clear. For example, in Curse of Strahd, which we played on Friday, you guys fought Izek Strasny. He did some kidnapping stuff, and you guys had just had it. You'd had it with him, and it's like, I'm not even going to give him a chance to talk. Like, we find him, we kill him, and that's fine. And I can see why it played out that way. That doesn't mean I'm also not prepared for social interaction before combat. So there is lore to Izek Strasny's story that could be useful. And if you kill him, maybe you don't have access to that lore. But that doesn't sound very fun because everybody wants to know the story. So I figure out a different way to provide you with that lore, like through a vision or something like that, because we're all magical beings, sort of. so eventually some sort of weird, it's kind of, sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but it kind of reminds me of that like conspiracy theory about these weird particles that cause spontaneous combustion. It's like just random magic. This is like 5 years ago I found this out. Some people think that there's like a particle that appears in space-time and enters your body and causes you to burst into flame because there's all these unsolved combustion mysteries. And I'm just like, okay, I don't think that's real, but what if it was real? And then I put it in my world.
And actually, I think that is an awesome point, which is just as like a player, like as a DM, sometimes you want your player characters to, instead of saying that's not what my character would do, you want them to ask, if my character were to do this, why would it be? The same thing can happen, which is, I'm disappointed they didn't find out this NPC story. How can I still tell this story even if they just one-shotted the NPC? Because a lot of times, like in that game, in Curse of Strahd, I'm RPing a very specific character personality that, again, doesn't ask questions, shoot first, later, and he also thinks he's a demigod. That's not necessarily true, it's just how he thinks of himself. And no one has disproven him yet, because there hasn't been an encounter where he hasn't just completely murdered everybody. So, like, it's one of those things where as a player, it can be really interesting to start with kind of a limited thing, but kind of build the opportunity for a character arc depending on what the DM kind of throws at them. So yeah, no, that's a really good point. How can I tell the story even if the character has died?
Speaking of player habits, I was thinking we could talk about how the DM encourages and discourages certain player habits through gameplay, through setting up certain scenarios for the players to navigate, and discouraging certain choices when they feel that it's appropriate, and encouraging certain choices when they feel it's appropriate. And this is actually tying into something that is presented pretty quickly in an intro psych class. This is a board game. But psychology is still very prevalent, especially when it comes to good storytelling, if you ask me. So what we're talking about here is the concept of reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement is the increase of a certain behavior through a stimulus. Punishment is decreasing a certain behavior through a stimulus. These stimuli can be positive or negative. A positive stimulus is the addition of that stimulus. A negative stimulus is the removal of the stimulus. So you can have positive and negative reinforcement and positive and negative punishment, which a lot of people tend to get a little confused, because whenever we talk about punishment, it's always decreasing a behavior. Like, it's like, no, bad, don't do that. But we never really think about these two sides of the coin, the positive and negative side of the coin. And so what I think is interesting is that when the DM sets up an encounter and sets up certain solutions to the encounter, they can include this kind of mindset when they're doing so in order to create better player habits, but not just like training. I'm not talking about like you're brainwashing your players into doing some stuff. It's like, we know that this is for example, say a player is really disruptive all the time. And they're always butting into other people's turns just to say something flavorful. For example, it's somebody else's turn and they're like, all right, I'm going to load my crossbow because I have to do that. And then the other player comes in and it's like, I whistle and say, good luck shooting at this guy. Yeah, you could do it. And it's like, okay, thanks, but I got to load my crossbow. and that's like a disruptive behavior, a very simple disruptive behavior. They get much worse than that. maybe you want to, psychologically speaking, the word you would use, you want to punish that player to discourage the behavior. Not, it sounds bad, but I promise it's not. It's just the language. And so what you could do is you can either add a stimulus that will discourage that behavior. For example, I don't know, a mechanical disadvantage or something like that. That would be, I wouldn't do that. Like it's very situational, but
Well, just to cut in for a second, I mean,
yeah,
the other
sure.
being the disruptive person, like that would be like a positive punishment would also be like the DM telling them to knock it off, right? And then they would be embarrassed by it, ideally. So that's what discourages them from disrupting again, is they don't want to be embarrassed in front of everybody or whatever.
Yeah, that's actually a much better example. This is why I wanted to talk to you guys about it, because I thought you might have some good examples. A negative punishment would be to remove a stimulus, which will decrease the behavior. Now, when we talk about children, usually it's like you take away their favorite toy because they were bad, and you're giving them a negative stimulus to take away, remove that behavior. Let's see here, because I have a little table.
Could it also be taking their phones away at the table? So, like, if somebody's texting or playing games, you make a rule that you can't have your phone. So that takes away from the unwanted behavior of like playing games instead of paying attention. So now, is that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, that's quite correct. So, like on my little table here, it says something is removed to decrease the likelihood of a behavior. When with the stealth example, that would be positive punishment because you're adding the fact that the guard can see them now. So it's a little wonky, and that's why I thought we would talk about it, because we talk all the time about encouraging or discouraging player habits, but there is a real psychological study of how that is done, how behavioral influence is created. And I'm glad we're talking about it now, because I was confused. This was like 2 years ago when I was in intro psych. So,
well, it's interesting too, because I guess what's the line between a negative punishment and a negative enforcement? Because like, let's go back to taking their phones away at the table. Now you're not only are you decreasing the unwanted behavior of them texting instead of paying attention, you're also increasing the behavior of them paying attention. So like, at what point are we looking at this where a lot of these things start to overlap,
Yeah, and it's a little bit, I guess you could say it's kind of binary at first. Like, you really don't want to have too many factors. You just want the reinforcement or punishment, or wait a minute, you want the stimulus and you want the behavior. Those are the two, that's how this is based on behavioralism. For example, Pavlov's own experiments in training dogs to salivate when they hear a bell. That's through this kind of a system. So when you start adding more factors, it becomes much more complex. So really, you have to resolve each individual behavior and stimulus as they come up. But you have to start somewhere, and that's like the whole goal. So when it comes to the difference between, you said a negative punishment and a negative reinforcement. What was that, your question? Okay, yeah. So the difference between negative punishment and negative reinforcement is both are removing something from the system. The reinforcement increases the behavior. Punishment decreases the behavior. So a real world example of negative reinforcement is wearing your seatbelt after you've been nagged by your car's beeping noise to wear your seatbelt. When you put your seatbelt on, the noise goes away, negative reinforcement. Because when we say negative and positive, and this is one thing that often confuses people, even myself, of course, is that these aren't qualitative. These are not qualitative, concepts. They're just the fact that you are adding or removing, adding or subtracting. What's the word? Empirical. That's the word. These are empirical concepts, not qualitative. Quantitative is the other word for it. And so I think it's pretty interesting.
Quantitative is quantities. Qualitative is quality. It's
So like, as opposed to good or bad is my point. Positive and negative is not good or bad in this sense. It is the addition or subtraction of something. And so that's so I think we got we got positive and negative punishment then. Positive reinforcement. Well, let's see. Say in the real world, say you do your job, you get paid. Positive reinforcement. You get paid to do the job because you did the job. Good job. In D&D, you could reward this with inspiration if you want to increase role play or something like that. That's usually what inspiration is used for, is when a character does something really in character and you reward them for it. The negative reinforcement to encourage a behavior. So let's go back to the Witcher example, where Geralt has this weird tattoo on his face that burns whenever he does something that is not in line with the other creature's thing, which, by the way, is a positive punishment.
Well, and that's what I was going to say, is you brought up the seatbelt example, and that's what I mean by this is a psychological, there is a scientific study here, but there's also a philosophical study, because at what point is the negative reinforcement also based on a positive punishment? Because when you're not wearing your seatbelt and your alarm is going off, that's a positive punishment. And then the behavior is negatively reinforced when you put your seatbelt on and it stops. So yeah. I think there is just like a tighter relationship between a lot of these that makes it harder to like create a hard distinction between a lot of them. And
yeah,
you had mentioned before, Ian, before we started recording, about neuro-linguistic programming. And one of the things a lot of positive psychologists talk about is the value of framing your language in a positive light in terms of the qualitative, which is good versus bad, as opposed to the addition or subtraction of something, which is what you're talking about with positive and negative. So I do think that the language can play an interesting role in how a DM designs in their reinforcement and their punishments into their game setting. But I'll stop interrupting you rudely.
No, that was a fantastic addition to the discussion there, because it's also bringing up this conflict that's within psychology itself. Psychology is not a unified field by any means. There is a lot, and that's purely because behavior, we don't understand behavior. It doesn't make sense. Like you can say the brain is like a computer, and when you put a stimulus into the brain, you get an output. You know, like there's all these like analogies, but the brain isn't a computer. It's so much more complex than that. I think when they calculated how much storage or something that the brain has in comparison to a computer when it comes to information, it was something upwards of like 300 terabytes or something like that. And I like, that's an insane amount of information for one thing. And for another, how do you even sort all that? You know how much RAM you have to process an entire like brain's worth of information, you know? So the computer analogy doesn't work because the brain doesn't work that way. Synapses make connections and sever connections all the time. And when you're talking about reinforcement and punishment, that is actually the manipulation of these connections between your synapses. Your behavior is reinforced or punished by the feeling you get when you do that behavior. So that's behavioralism. But then there's other things like empiricism, and other ones that I don't remember because it's been 2 years. And so this is just one way to look at it. I don't want to say, hey, DMs, take this basic psychology thing and always use it all the time, and you'll be able to train your players to like come running when you ring a bell. Like, yeah, that's not our goal. This is just an idea that you can have in mind when creating encounters, when creating puzzles, to say, hey, you know, this is a good way to think about things when you're encountering these puzzles and you know, combats and stuff. Or hey, when you're talking to an NPC, don't be a jerk, you know. And don't be a jerk is a punishment. You're stopping that behavior. So I think it's useful. It's not by any means like the only tool in your toolbox, and it is not a hard and fast rule. It's just an idea that we, like Adam was saying before, we are drawing inspiration from the real world science of psychology to create an environment that is more conducive to fun gameplay which is the whole goal in the end.
It's interesting to note here that we can use this commonalities in psychology, like when we're training pets. But in the grander frame of this, of other human beings, we can be creatures of habit, and those habits can be broken in a lot of different ways, and sometimes randomly or seemingly randomly. Our behavior is still, for all the things that we know about psychology, there are so many mysteries still present, and for all the things that and discoveries we've made on neuroscience, there's still a lot we don't fully understand or really grasp. We have theories, we have hypotheticals and all that. But looking at it, these are not binary choices, and we are not creatures of flipped switches that we just can't just flip on and off. In order to make the best outcome, we have to flip these switches on and then turn these switches off. But they're really powerful elements to think about when we ponder our own presentation and execution and the language that we're using as we present ideas. Because I know I've changed the way I describe things. For some groups, I'll describe things on a more mechanical plane, where I'll be very clear and upfront about how the action economy operates, what is a spell, what is a feature, what is a legendary action, and what is a movement or whatever. I'll use game terms for certain groups because those groups I want to build in their habits and reinforce their agency. In order to do that, they need to know when they can respond to things. So he is casting a spell, counterspell, and understanding that. And then I have other groups that don't want me to talk like that. That having that very action economy mechanical language, they actually don't want. They want to figure out what I'm saying and how it's working from a narrative perspective. And we can change the way that we present information to help garner stronger habits at every table, but also to create the experience at the table that the players desire, that they are the most engaged by and the most energized by. This means that when we try to bring this all back into a DM's space and a player's space, none of these are a catch-all. And as we discuss it, it's important to recognize that even the tools that I've presented may not work for certain people. And everything that we bring up here should be approached with a measure of tact and an ability to also discard it if you do not need it. Nothing is bound and nothing is iron. You can take what you want in the Jeet Kune Do world. You can just take what works for you and discard the rest. You can take what works for you and remix it. But this, when it comes to our language, I used to be of a mind that I needed to be punitive with my players. And it's because I at that time had players at my table that were punitive to me and were combative in how they framed the story and how the rules were interpreted. And that came from their past experiences and the habits that were reinforced by the tables that they were at. And those habits had to be broken at my table, and I had to break my own defensive habits. Which is also a curious thing to just open yourself up to, that there's what about my habits and what about the way I'm presenting things may be subconsciously reinforcing difficult behaviors at the table. And how can I present things so that the players don't feel attacked, that they don't feel defensive? I'm getting kind of deep here.
Well, so first, I think one of the things that Ian said, I think I've mentioned this book before on this channel too, which is Jesse Schell's Art of Game Design, where he talks about, just like psychology, game design is not a unified field of study. You can't quantify fun for people, but what you can do is you can look at it through a lot of different lenses. And when you look at it through specific lenses, there might be a unique amount of value or a unique approach that might really enrich whatever experience you're designing, right? And really what we're saying is that psychology as a field of study, and this particular principle of it has value in game design, because part of how enriching the experience you're delivering is understanding how your players receive information, So it's kind of like what we're talking about with the structure of a game a few episodes back, where a lot of times we as DMs are focused on the rules, the mechanics, what should resolve, as opposed to, has everyone had time to eat? Like, are they in an environment that allows them to focus in the way I really want them to? How have I set up the volume of my music so that they can hear me, like you were talking about during the break, Adam, with Tenet, so that rather they can easily hear me and they aren't using more energy than is necessary to really process the information I'm giving them. And a lot of times, like you said, you can really figure out what energizes your players based on the questions they're asking, So if they're asking mechanical questions, don't ignore their gameplay questions because you're interested in the narrative, Or if they're asking narrative questions, give them a narrative answer, But the other thing is, a lot of times players will also, like, to go one level deeper, they'll be asking questions based on how you're presenting the information. So if you want a storytelling game, but you're not allowing them to do things because the book doesn't say it, now what you're doing is you're telling them that their narrative doesn't matter, So, and that's where this punishment and reinforcement thing really can have a lot of value. It might not be that your players are mechanically minded. It might be that you've positively punished them from not being mechanically minded because you keep telling them your stuff doesn't work. You can't counterspell this because I'm the DM and I said so, So a lot of times, if you're like, why aren't my players using more creative spells? It's like, well, you've designed monsters that have really high saving throws, magic resistance, and a bunch of legendary resistances. They know that their thing isn't going to work. So because they've tried before and you've positively punished them by saying it doesn't work, so now they're not going to try that stuff. And you've limited the excitement of the storytelling because of that. So, and I think that's again, I've talked about encouraging and discouraging behaviors. But what I was really talking about is what Ian's talking about, which is just looking at punishment and reinforcement. Now, one of the things I will throw my 2 cents in on this little summary, in our martial arts school, one of the first things we learn to use is positive reinforcement, right? Which is when a student does something well, you want to be excited for them so that they know that they did it well. And a lot of times, positive reinforcement makes the punishment side of it obsolete, because rather than focusing on how to punish your players, you're not reinforcing the behaviors you actually want them to see. Sometimes, like Ian mentioned, if a player's being disrespectful or disruptive, you do need in psychological terms, a punishment for that, especially if it's over the line, But why bring attention to what you don't want to see when you could instead be putting that energy towards something you do want to see?
Yeah, and because the way this sounds in layman's terms, reinforcement and punishment, it sounds kind of like, I don't know, disparaging a little bit. Like, it's a little bit unusual for common language to use the words reinforcement and punishment when trying to change the behavior of players, actual people, because it's like, well, we use that for pets, we use that for dogs. Like, it's not, we're humans, we're different, we think differently, and that might be true. But if you allow yourself to step back from that reaction, if we just take these terms for what they are, which is representations of a certain definition of increasing or decreasing a behavior, then it becomes less, I guess, inflammatory, is how I feel. Because I'm just nervous that people are going to misinterpret this as saying, like, you need to train your players. You don't. No. Like, you all want to have a good time. This is just one of those tools.
Let me throw a monkey wrench in, Ian.
Oh, sure.
It's not that you always are.
Yeah,
you're not.
but
You can't even think of it as I'm not doing this, because, like we say, you're always teaching. It's not whether or not you're punishing or reinforcing. It's you are. How are you punishing and reinforcing?
Yeah, so that's another way to look at it. A much better way, actually, is that just by the fact of you being the DM and being the arbiter of the rules, you are always doing something to reinforce or discourage a certain behavior. So why not use some psychological tools for it? There was also this thing you mentioned where you were talking about how the first thing you do when you start teaching at the dojo for new students and stuff is you use positive reinforcement. And in fact, in behavioralism, positive reinforcement is actually like the most effective way to teach a person or animal a new behavior that you want. And that's like a good thing too, because if you continue to use negative reinforcement where you continue to take away something to encourage a behavior, or if you keep using positive punishment, like these negative emotions, I guess you can say, that are generated, they start to build up, they stack up, and you can never predict positive reinforcement is like the best way to do it because it's also the most consistent. The other ways, you can't predict always how somebody's going to take it, how somebody's going to learn the lesson that you're trying to teach, because you might not even realize that there's an additional lesson. If, for example, for parents who spank their kids, there's an additional lesson there. I did something bad, therefore I feel pain. Okay, that's one lesson. The other lesson is I did something bad, now my parent is scary and I'm scared of them. So that's not something you want. You don't want to make them scared of you. You just want them to not do the thing that you keep telling them not to do. And I don't, just to clarify, I don't advocate for spanking. I'm just using an example here. And so it's important to recognize that by using the neurolinguistics of positive reinforcement and rewarding good behavior while not always acknowledging the bad behavior unless it's like really disruptive, like John's saying, focusing on the good behavior can kind of wash away that negative behavior because the good behavior becomes the priority. I'm not a psychologist, just to clarify. This is intro psych stuff. My goal here is just to present you guys with some tools that you might be able to use to look at things through a new lens. I'm not a psychologist, not a doctor. Do not consider this to be any sort of medical advice, please. Or whatever, This is just an exploration. It's a what do you call it? A thought exercise, basically.
Yeah, well, and you don't have to be a psychologist to see very simple tools of how this can be used in play. This is something that I started doing immediately when I started DMing, which is when a player tries something creative, positively reinforce it with a mechanical boost. So if instead of like, oh, well, for flavor this happens, but there's not a rules thing that happens. Now you basically told them you're not going to be, the behavior of coming up with something creative is not going to be enforced at my table, So like when you do something like, let's say it's a goblin or a bugbear, this happened in my Wednesday game, is standing in a river. And one of my players is playing an Order of Scribes wizard. And they substituted their burning hands for a cold damage spell. So they had frost hands, Not only did the bugbear have disadvantage on his dex save, he also got dealt the normal damage, and he had to make a strength save because his feet got frozen to the river, right? So now that player instantly is reinforced. Let me ask about the environment to see if I can play off of it. As opposed to, oh, well, he gets extra frost because he's in the river. He doesn't get any extra damage or anything, but it was kind of cool you did that. Now it's like, well, now I'm not going to ask that question because I'm not going to get anything from a gameplay perspective. and actually this is one thing I wanted to bridge to real quick, which is we were talking about neurolinguistics, and one of the shifts I started to make for myself, I've noticed a change with me. I don't know if other people have noticed a change in them. When I stopped referring to things as mechanics and started to refer to things as gameplay, because all of a sudden mechanics seemed to be some like a term that was put against narrative, you know? So like we've talked about how mechanics and narrative work together, but a lot of times people are like, oh, ignore the mechanics, just describe it. Or I don't want to hear the description, I want to hear the mechanics. What if you start referring to the mechanics as just gameplay? Because remember, the goal of the game is fun. So gameplay sounds a lot more fun than mechanics. Mechanics sounds like a foundational thing you have to learn. Gameplay sounds like something you get to do, which is, and how does that start to change your understanding of how to build a character? Instead of looking at a character's story, what if you start with a character's gameplay? You know, how do you want your character to play? Now let's create a story around that gameplay. Or you have a really strong story. What will be the gameplay that lets you tell that story? That's very different than a mechanics approach or a rules approach, which are a lot more restrictive. Gameplay is literally how we're having fun with it and how we get to interact with the game state. Can't be too powerful because then it's unbalanced, but it changes the way I feel like the same concept gets received, you know? So, and I'm wondering, I'm curious if that ends up being, for the narrative players you were talking about, Adam, the ones that almost ignore the mechanics text, if we started introducing it and teaching it as this is the gameplay versus this is the narrative, and when does the narrative become the gameplay? That we don't roll dice, you tell me something, I tell you something back. We don't worry about the numbers because the important thing is having fun and just having this back and forth and this dialogue. What possibilities get created out of that too?
It's important to note here too that a lot of the things that we're mentioning here, it's almost like a streamlining of techniques and elements that we already have at our tables. So when we start to bring out, I'm going to reference Grail's book 2. I've got one group that is going to be doing their legacy games, which we've mentioned before here in the podcast, and then another group that's going to start the book 2, start the new setting. And when it comes to asking these questions and where, if we think about we often reference the game state. And I think in the past, I've referenced the game state as it's almost like the overlay. It's the HUD that you would see on the screen. It's when you can see the game program running in the background. I think we have already, in our games, we have made so many upgrades and adjustments, and we've evolved in great ways to really acknowledge the needs of our players at the table in nuanced ways. And none of us are perfect. And I don't think we ever will be. But we've made such great strides in trying to make a positive and dynamic experience, table to table, group to group. But when we think about the language that we use, there's always a way to make it flow easier. We've talked a lot about resistance and flow. And I think a good lesson for me is to remove the term mechanics. Just like practice that. See if I can get rid of that for now. And see if I replace it with gameplay, what is that going to do? Because I know, as I believe, that we've all done this already, that the skills and the techniques in play, we've already done them, but they may have been not as smooth. And what little changes can we make in the language that we use to make that jump or that translation faster? So instead of me presenting things as mechanics, if I present them as gameplay, does that just reach our conclusion faster? Do our players just get on board faster? in which case the resistance, the hang-ups, and the modes of confusion or misunderstanding are diminished if we just use clear language. There's a wonderful class that I pursued in my master's. It was a requirement when we were doing research, and my professor was a master of being simple, clean, and precise in his language. And this was a person who spoke slowly but without a loss of cadence, and would choose words carefully. But he wasn't, though his vocabulary was vast, he was not a person that would be verbose. He would be clean and precise. So if the best word is the, then he uses the. If the best word is gameplay, then he uses gameplay. And it's an interesting lesson to think about the words that we use and how often we use them, even now, in trying to mitigate how many times I say the word to try and fill the space. How much more am I served by allowing myself to take a breath and speak? In thinking about this, there's a wonderful book out there called Simple, Brief, Precise. And it's a book on research writing, really. But its first few chapters are on lessons of choosing the best word for the job. It doesn't have to be a complex word. It doesn't have to be the top tier SAT word. If the word is accurate and it works and your audience understands precisely what you're saying, then use that word. You don't have to sound smart, quote unquote. That's not the importance. The importance is communication. I think that's one of the facets that we're getting toward here is how do we communicate effectively to our players what is expected of them, what is awesome about them, what is awesome about us, and how do we tell a cool story at this table, group to group, in the most, I won't say efficient, but in the best flow possible. Thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in to today's episode of the DM Shower Thoughts. This podcast uploads every Friday at noon on Podbean, Spotify, and iTunes. If you want to get episodes earlier than that and help support the show, you can go visit our Patreon over at patreon.com/DM Shower Thoughts. For early access content, custom DM coaching tools, and a whole bunch of other cool stuff, maybe go check that out. You can see our faces over on our YouTube channel, DM Shower Thoughts, and over at Twitch for DM_shower_thoughts. You can also find us on Twitter and a whole bunch at our Facebook page, GM Shower Thoughts. Don't forget about that. You can also read our words over at the GM's Corner at AdamStrakeProductions.com. And stay tuned for many more amazing adventures coming your way from the DM Shower Thoughts. Have a wonderful day, everybody, and please, game responsibly. Bye-bye now.
Games are fun to play. Whether it's chess, Mario Kart, or Dungeons & Dragons, we've all sat down to play a game with our friends before. But what is it that keeps us coming back to our favorites? How do developers craft the experiences that keep us this engaged? I'm Sully, host of the podcast Fun But Why. Join us as we talk to game industry professionals and break down the levels, mechanics, and design of their favorite gaming experiences. Fun But Why releases new episodes every Tuesday, wherever you get your podcasts.